I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to our Bamidbar series titled Community Between Order and Chaos, where we are exploring the gap between the vision for community laid out in Bamidbar and the real-life challenges to this order presented throughout the unfolding chapters. Each week, I'm partnering with a communal leader from around the world to explore these themes. We'll hear about their challenges and responses to this difficult year, as well as our usual deep dive into these themes in the Parsha. To sponsor an episode, please contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or contact the Matan office directly. A last reminder to sign up for the Matan summer program titled War and Peace in Jewish Sources. You can sign up for 1 week, for 1 day, for 1 tour. I'll be teaching there along with a lovely lineup of Matan faculty. The dates of the program are between the 7th of July to the 25th of July, and you can check out the website for more details. Parshat Shelach opens with a divine commandment to send spies to the land of Israel. Famously, when this event is recapped in the first chapter of Derim, it is presented as the people's initiative. Either way, the reconnaissance mission doesn't go well for the people, and their negative reporting costs them 40 years of wandering in the desert, and the generation of the Exodus is punished to die there. Stricken by guilt, a group tries to reach Israel, but is quickly overcome by enemies and killed. This was just too much, too late. After this, the Parsha concludes with a somewhat random grouping of laws, the commonality being that they will all be fulfilled when the people enter the land of Israel. Chazal and other commentators point out that this is likely meant as a comfort to the people. They will not be able to enter the land of Israel, but their children will be able to fulfill these laws. Among them are wine offerings and others that accompany the sacrifices, the challah, peace given to the priest, sacrifices given for wrongdoing by the community, the case of the wood gatherer from which it is learned that there exists a more severe punishment of stoning for purposeful desecration of Shabbat, and finally the mitzvah to wear tzitzit. All of these passages have been explored for their connection to the reconnaissance story that precedes them, whether connected linguistically, as in the word latur used by the tzitzit, and the spy story, or the details provided about collective sin offerings, perhaps meant to be in dialogue with the collective sin recounted at the Parsha's beginning. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Mijal Bitton, who is a Torah teacher, a sociologist of American Jews, and serves as the Rosh Kehillah of the downtown Minyan in New York City. She is committed to building vibrant and welcoming Jewish life. Mijal is also the co-host of the podcast Wandering Jews with Noam Weissman. Mijal, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I think that it's obvious that it's unique that you stand at the head of a kehillah, and I wondered if before we sort of get into our Parsha conversation, if you could just explain to us a little bit about what you do, what does it mean to be the Rosh Kehillah of the community, and a little bit about what your community looks like also. I think that would be helpful for our audience to really sort of get a sense of who we're speaking with today.
Sure. I would say that perhaps as a way to explain what I'm building is that I don't think it should be unique for any of us to lead a community. I think that if Hashem gave a certain desire to lead the Jewish people and to do good, that there's so much space to exercise leadership. So I helped co-found this community about 7 years ago, the Downtown Minyan. We serve mostly young professionals and graduate students in Lower Manhattan. And Yosefa, when I try to explain what we do, I often say, imagine the warmth and the openness of Chabad married with the intellectual striving of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. That's at least aspirationally what we're trying to build here. And we're trying to just not hold ourselves back from some limitations that I don't think should be limitations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I mean, it's funny because 2 episodes ago, we also had Rabbanit Shira Mervis, who's a Rabbanit of a kehillah where I live. So if you just listen to the podcast, I agree with you that it doesn't necessarily need to be exceptional, but obviously in the actual milieu of what we see in the Orthodox world, it can be somewhat unusual. But so you're saying that you're appealing to that particular audience of those that are living in that space. And is this, this is weekly shul participation? Is it also, a congregation, a kehillah that exists during the week? I'm just curious about like the breadth of how the kehillah functions.
Yeah, we meet every single Shabbat. We don't have a daily minyan, but we do have weekly classes. Last night we had our first open mic night, in which community members presented. It was amazing, actually. I felt, Yosef, like I was all day in conversations with other leaders talking about anti-Semitism and geopolitics and all of that. And then I had Jewish joy for 2 hours, just being with other young Jews and hearing them sing and perform. And it felt really healing, like a real gift to be there.
I think as the conversation continues, we'll hear a little bit more about some of, why the healing needs to come, and obviously the difficulties that we've had this year. I think we'll probably get into that a little bit more as our conversation continues. I guess on that note, I'd love for us to sort of jump into our prism through which we're going to look at this Parsha. And because of the theme of the series, and also I think really because of who you are and the perspective you have on this topic, you really send some, at least to me, what seemed to be some really different ways to look at the spy story. So we're going to sort of look at it through this communal lens. And I'd love for you to jump into that wherever it feels right for you. What does that mean? Who's the community? Who are the people that we're dealing with? Sort of how you look at how the spies functioned in this Parsha.
Yeah, sure. First, I'll say maybe a couple of things just about the Book of Numbers, or an approach to think about the wilderness, Bamidbar. One, I'll just own like an emotional piece. I feel like, we're still at the beginning of Bamidbar, and part of me feels like it's very reflective of what we are living through right now, just feeling in the wilderness and seeing all of these pitfalls, to a sense that I'm almost like Vayikra felt a little bit like an escape, to think about this like big questions around like society and leadership and how do you move towards the promised land. And Bamidbar is the wilderness. And in many ways, I think it gives us a mirror to where we are right now, in our Jewish moment and our Jewish communities. So that's one thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say about Bamidbar is that I give a drasha every Shabbat, and for a couple of years already, I began to be a little bit frustrated with the way that I grew up learning Bamidbar. And it might be different than you, Yosefa, but I grew up with what felt a little bit like a caricature of the people. It's almost like oh, everything was perfect. They were walking towards the promised land. Hashem gave them absolutely everything. And then they messed up. And they were so foolish. And they did everything wrong. And that whole generation died in the wilderness. And they couldn't go to the promised land. And only if they would not have acted this way, we would have just been in a much better place. And that frustrated me, maybe just bringing in my work as a sociologist. Because I think part of the work that we have to do is really try to understand, not necessarily to agree, not to say things were right, but I think if we caricature people so much, then we cannot learn from them about the same impulses that might live within us and that might live in our own day and age. So those are just two quick introductory remarks that I think we should be looking at this episode with the spies, the scouts, the meraglim, as a way that helps us uncover questions right now. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to actually try to do deep, thick understanding. How could it be that a people that was taken out of slavery in Egypt, that accepted the Torah, that had a covenant with God, that had open miracles, that they had this massive, you could call this like the second greatest national catastrophe of the Jewish people. The first one is the sin of the golden calf in the book of Exodus, Shemot. This one in the book of Bamidbar. And according to our sages, it's one that really inaugurates pretty much any dark episode in Jewish history. Is taken back to this moment. Chazal say, you cried here for no reason. It's going to become crying for the generations. So that's just introduction. So I don't know, do you want to, do you agree, disagree?
No, first of all, I totally agree with you. I think many of us were given that caricature. But the thing is that when I learned Bamidbar, I think that it makes so much sense that I actually have a hard time even identifying with some of the questions. Because to me, I think of, and maybe this is too low of a metaphor, but I keep thinking about a family that's in a car ride together. And it's nice for 20 minutes. And then somebody's crying, somebody's asking for food. At some point, either parents start losing it as well. To me, so much of this is so understandable that I think that sometimes I may be over personalizing right, over making them too regular, because to me it sounds like a disaster. And I'll give that one other element, which really comes also from, I believe it was in the Shadal, his commentary, where he basically says outright something that I've thought for a long time, and I was happy to see him write it, which is that he said clearly there needed to be a reason why we would keep Am Yisrael in the Midbar for 40 years. Meaning he comes back to this question of, well, is this really the reason why they're there for 40 years? He said, what? How else were Am Yisrael supposed to be able to get Moshe's Torah? If they didn't have 40 years to make it part of themselves, then he's like, how else would this have worked? They would have been there for, a very short period of time. They would have gone into the land of Israel, and everybody would have gone into their Nechalot, and we would never have established like an actual legacy of who Am Yisrael is that follows Moshe's Torah. And I thought that was really fascinating, because I feel like when we read the book of Bamidbar, whether one agrees with the idea or not, we sort of struggle with, wait a minute, could this ever have evolved differently? Meaning maybe it didn't have to evolve from a story of sin, but could it ever have been different? How would it have been if we would have been pulled out of Egypt and, just put right there in Eretz Yisrael? And I thought it was fascinating that he actually pinned it specifically here on our story and said this was all part of Hashem's plan, and it comes back to this question of who actually sent the spies. Again, it gets us into some tricky theological waters, but I'm just bringing that in because I think that it very much creates a very realistic picture of who Am Yisrael are at this moment of our history.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard that Perush before. It reminds me a little bit of a way to see Moshe's own lack of entry into the land of Israel as something that was necessary for the people of Israel to have to have the kind of leadership that they needed. The one word you used at the end, you said this was all part of Hashem's plan. And then you acknowledged there were theological questions. And I think some of those theological questions have to do with free will and with responsibility and with, can we look at this, the leaders of this community and what they brought, because in many ways we can insist on both, on saying there was something here that looking back perhaps was necessary. I still have to think about that to see if I fully agree. If I find it as, it feels compelling. I want to stay with it for longer. And then, what does this teach us about the pitfalls of leadership now? So, Yosef, I actually want to just share with you some Pirushim that I brought to try to understand the scouts. I'm just going to say spies, but a more neutral way is the scouts to speak about them. But we basically have these 12 men who are leaders in their communities. So the assumption is that they have certain moral righteousness, that perhaps they have certain strategic vision and clarity. They can think about the collective, more about themselves. And Moshe, asked by God, basically sends them to scout the land. And we know the story. They come back, and 10 out of the 12 basically give an evaluation of their ability to. They don't just talk about the land. They evaluate the Jewish people's ability to enter and conquer the land. And they basically say, we cannot do this. And that, of course, inaugurates the catastrophe that becomes, eventually Tisha B'Av and, the Israel, that generation dying in the wilderness. But I want to just look at 3 Perushim and try to use them to understand this 10 men who basically said that we couldn't go into the promised land. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's great. I also just wanted to point out that these specific men who are chosen specifically for this, because they're not the Nesi'im, right? Meaning at the outset, they're choosing people who are meant for whatever skills they thought they needed. These were the men chosen. I think that that's also just a really important piece, because it wasn't like, oh, we'll just take any leader. But no, they obviously put real effort into figuring out who they thought would be the right messengers. So I think that that's also just an important thing to think about in terms of the positive intentions that likely went into this endeavor initially.
Well, I'm just curious, Zefa, do you mean by that you think that they could have been less beholden to less beholden to a leadership position than if it was in a sim? That was part of the intent?
I mean, in theory, I'm saying you just see that there's intention here because they choose specific people for this specific mission.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Okay, so let's jump into it. The first Perush I actually want to bring is a Perush that most people going to Jewish day school learn when they learn about the Meraglim. I want to bring Rashi and how Rashi explains a little bit what happened here. I'll say, by the way, there's different approaches to how much to go to the Pshat, to what the text says without, all the Agadot on top of them first. But I find this Rashi actually really intriguing. So it's a pretty famous Rashi. Talks about their report that the spies say it's a land that devours its inhabitants. And Rashi says like this, it says that in every place that they went, they said to the people that they found basically funerals, people who were just burying other people. All of these funerals happening everywhere they went. And Rashi says that Kadosh Baruch Hu asa letova, really, there was a divine plan that was happening here. That Hashem wanted to almost like distract the native inhabitants to prevent them from noticing the foreign spies in their midst. So you have Hashem's plan that's trying to really do something good, like almost give like a protective layer to this Meraglim. And the Meraglim look at this, at least 10 of them, and they say, look at this land. This land is absolutely terrible. We cannot come here. It devours its inhabitants. So, Yusafa, what do you think about this Rashi before I share some thoughts?
No, I know. I think that it just brings home this point continually that we can constantly see things from two perspectives. Like we can see things, the Midrash is saying, oh, God did this on purpose so that they wouldn't notice you. It was to help you succeed, right? But they saw, because they had their negative bias coming in, right? That's the whole, they're starting with the negative bias. They can't even see the positive aspect of that. There's just, I'm just smiling because there's been so many moments. There's always moments like this in our life, but this year in particular, there's just been so many moments where I've actually felt myself and people around me make a choice about how to view something. It's always true, but sometimes it's just more pronounced than others. And this is one of those moments. Rashi gives us the bird eye view, according to the Midrash. I'm just thinking about that, about how we have that choice always to see things from two different perspectives. And a lot of times we're coming in already with a bias on one side.
Yeah. Another way, though, could be that it's not really a bias, but it's just a human way to look at the world, right? That if I'm walking into a land and I see just bad things happening there, and I can be taken up by terror, and maybe I'm not the type of leader that can have. I would even say that the exception is to be able to zoom out. And the exception is to be able to say what's in front of me is not what's real. I mean, it's not that it's not what's real. What's in front of me might be indicative to something else. And I almost feel like Rashi has this impatience with them. Like, how didn't they realize that Hashem was really trying to make them a favor and do something good for them? And I actually have a lot of, I'll just say here, empathy. If I'm taking Rashi literally here, I have a lot of empathy for the terror that it brings. Terror either because you don't understand, or, and I don't want to be too in the nose here right now with what's happening in the world, Yusafa, but I think a different way of reading this is that...
Yeah, go for it. I hear you. Go for it. I hear it.
No, what if the promised land is hard?
Yeah. Agreed.
What if there's a cost there?
Yeah.
Right? What if?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, I actually have, I wish we wouldn't have been in the desert for those extra years. I don't, the Shadal approach, I just find it almost painful because I'm like, I don't want the dark part. I want to just, go straight in. But I think there's something here that asks us to consider a couple of things. First of all, what does it mean to be able to look at a dark reality and to have different interpretations? What kind of leadership do we need for that? And I would even say here, what does it mean to have the kind of leadership in a community in which you understand that certain things, like the promised land, right? I'm taking it in a different place right now, Yosef. I'm not saying it's the same thing at all. But that it, and you're in Israel right now, so I feel almost like inadequate saying this sitting here.
No, I'm totally with you, and I'm taking this very, like I never thought about this Rashi this way, but I'm actually thinking about it a lot in connection. I've just been teaching for a few weeks now at the end of the year, a little bit of Sefer Shoftim, and like also the beginning where it speaks about like what are the point of the enemies in the land of Israel. And you're like, could this be any less relevant to what's going on right now? Meaning it's also a little bit why I'm teaching it right now. But no, I think that there are actually, it's not our topic today, but like there are a whole host of sources that speak very openly about the pain and the loss that is incumbent in living in Israel. And I think that you're totally spot on. And I never thought about Rashi this way. I think that it's, and it is. And you see, I'll speak because I live here. Like you see the people around this year who are like, I can't hold space for this much more. Do you know what I'm saying? Like the towel is totally saturated. And that means different things for people. For some people, that means emotionally checking out. That's what it's been for me. Like on many moments, like emotionally checking out because I can't hold it anymore. And other, for somebody it might be going on vacation, getting out, seeing a land that isn't constantly burying their dead, like the opposite of Rashi. So I'll carry that piece. I think that it's very, very, very poignant what you're saying.
Yeah. I'll say, by the way, you asked me before offline, just the challenges that we are thinking about in America. I'll name some of them as we go through this. I think one of them is that for many American Jews, especially those operating in liberal spaces, there's a very big crisis right now because you're holding on to a commitment that is now stigmatized is a soft way to say it, right? It's demonized.
Yeah.
And I think there's something, one of the things I've been thinking about is what does it mean to actually, part of what we American Jews need to almost like, kind of like internalize. It's like things are not going to go back to where they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And okay, so it's a heavy burden to bear. So we'll stand up and we'll bear it. And there's a cost to pay and it's worth it. And there's no question about it. But I think that is a question that lives in the in-between space between communities and leadership. I don't think it's just for leadership. I think it's something for communities when they're able to get up and say, we are going to go there. And it's not easy, but we're going to do it. That's something that I actually think Americans just need to learn from Israelis about what it means to have that kind of holding yourself up and moving forward. We could spend hours on this, but I want to just share two other quick interpretation of the Meraglim and then just also a word on Kalev and Yeshua. But there's a Zohar that I found just really, really intriguing talking about the Meraglim. I'll just read just some of the words that they say. That they basically say that they were good and righteous people, but they began to have like an etzara'ah between them. By the way, you can almost think about like the peer pressure. One of them starts and brings the other, like domino effect. And this is how the Zohar explains what happens here. They started to think, Im ikansu Israel la'aretz, ya'aviru otanu miliot rashim. If they go into the land of Israel, we are not going to be leaders anymore. We are maybe wilderness time leaders. We work really well here. And who knows what's going to happen if we go there. Maybe we were only merited to be leaders in the wilderness. And I don't know, Yosefa, when I read this, I was like, wow, this is spot on. What I mean by spot on, I'm like, this is really, really human. This is human, that you're always going to have this personal, right? This personal element of people who are thinking about their own position because that's what it means to be human, right? And you might even convince yourself that you're doing this for the right of the people, right? But that's like the personal politicking. Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
That ends up kind of shaping what they do.
Right, that's fascinating. I mean, I think there's also, by the way, we don't have to go into, there's also very interesting parallels for leaders coming into Israel, right? We don't have to go there, but I know that we both smell that same reality. But I think it's just fascinating to think about the leaders thinking about themselves, because I never think about the prism that way. Meaning I think about Am Yisrael, when they hear the negative report, very quickly say, right, who wants change? They rather keep things the way they are. And that's I think one of the classic ways of looking at the spy story. I never thought about it through the prism of those leaders themselves, that they're just worried about their own loss of position. I think more of a whole group of humans who've just been through tremendous change and aren't necessarily up for a whole nother kind of change. And only when these leaders get to Israel and see, again, inviting the modern parallels, they see how different of a space they're going to physical, emotional, spiritual, and just like daily occupation, how different of a space they'll have to occupy. And they're just like, I don't know, this isn't so compelling. But that's a fascinating element that I never thought of, like the actual leaders themselves being concerned about their position.
Yeah, but I think it translates into what you said about the people. Because I think that, first of all, if you are, I'll use the word beholden to a position or to an institution or to a space, and you, whether consciously or not, convince yourself that that's what should guide you as opposed to the collective welfare of the people, you will end up not helping the people do the hard thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like it will translate into what you communicate to everybody else because you're not modeling it yourself and you're resisting it yourself. And I'll say, by the way, challenges here, it's not just in Israel, in the US. Like part of the thing that I keep thinking about is we have so many amazing institutions and communities and structures, and many of them have been built for like peacetime Judaism, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And there is a transformation that needs to occur. And for many people, it could be incur loss because you may be a great peacetime leader. Are you a wartime leader? What are you going to have to give up? Which relationships will you have to, to really walk away from? What? Again, it goes away to the question of having to pay a cost.
Yeah.
But I'm going to just lead us to 1/3 kind of like Perush here, which I think is what you were maybe alluding to. So the Bala Kedar of Yitzhak Arama, 15th century, said the following. I'll say, by the way, that when I have a memory, I think it was 10th or 11th grade when I learned this in a modern Orthodox high school here in New York. And this was my teacher's favorite Perush because I think for her, it was almost a way of, I don't know if I want to call it apologetics, but it was a way to make the Meraglim continue to be super righteous, at least in the way that she presented it. And I think it's become popular in like neo-Hasidic kind of circles. That the chet of the Meraglim was בגלל שמעשו בחיים המוגבלים המאושרים של ידי התורה וארץ הקודש. Basically, I'm going to just paraphrase a little bit, that they, you know what, I'll say the way my teacher said it to me, just because I'm trying to be in conversation with her also. But basically, it was easy being close to God and being spiritual in the wilderness. There was you didn't have to build society. You didn't have to create a standing army. You did not have to figure out all the thorny problems of politics and taxation and everything that it takes to build a state. And as spiritual beings, they basically say, hey, we want to stay in the wilderness. We want to prioritize the ease with which we can have intimacy and closeness to God here, as opposed to what is just much more complicated, messier, corporeal, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Like, I will add here like political material life in the land of Israel. So the shallow way of saying this is to say they were such tzaddikim that they made like a mistake and they kind of like assumed that this was better for them spiritually. I do think there's like a deep read of this that says, again, it's like a similar theme that says that there's something that the land of Israel and communal and social life in Israel requires responsibility and requires a certain heaviness that, and like I think about myself, like my year in seminary, being in yeshiva, everything just, it's so much easier in some ways to kind of like know what your destiny is and fulfill it than being in the quote unquote real world and try to build something.
Yeah. I mean, I think also it's an element of it is that in theory, in the desert, there was a goal to get towards. And when you come into the land of Israel, or when you change your status, right? When somebody achieves a goal, right? You finish a doctorate, there's like a classic, crisis that happens. It's sort of like, well, what? I've been working towards a goal for a long time. What's my next goal? There's also just something very unnerving about that piece, about not knowing where it is you're headed towards. It's just, I just want to bring this in because it's so interesting how everybody literally flips each circumstance in the way that was fitting in their sort of the way they view these things. I believe it's the Rambam who says, but I saw it paraphrased again in Shadal, where he basically says it was really important for them, for Am Yisrael to have to be in the desert so that they would acquire a gvura. Now, what did he call gvura? Not showering. It says that they weren't able to have a merchatz, like to be able to go through a period of time where like your physical conditions are more difficult. And it's just interesting because some people will look at coming into the land of Israel and saying those are difficult physical conditions. And the Rambam said, well, it was important because going through that physically difficult experience in the desert will also build a certain kind of, we would say resilience. He uses the word gvura. So I just think that's interesting how you said, your teacher brought this because it sort of helped preserve the righteousness of the Meraglim. I just think it's interesting how looking at all these commentators, like how they're trying to struggle with, well, we obviously needed to do something in those 40 years. We needed those 40 years to fortify us. And then also, how is it possible that, these men could come into Israel and do this?
Yeah, it's funny. When you said that, I mean, what comes to mind is just thinking of my cousins in the army and they're not showering now in the summer. Like that is, you know what I mean?
I do. I'm married to someone who did and does the army, and I still don't understand. I'm like, how do you go from having a lovely home where you shower to then going a week and a half or 3 weeks? Our friends were in Gaza, and you don't shower. And I say whatever I say, to me, it's fascinating on a character level. Like, how do you switch?
I'll say something else here, and without getting into this, I do think that this view of the Meraglim touches on one of the big rifts in Israeli and Jewish society right now around service and what you prioritize and not prioritize in terms of service. There's almost this could be read as a quasi, I'm not saying he's saying this, but this could be read as a quasi, religious anti-Zionist critique of the state and what it takes for the state to operate versus spiritual. You could guess where I stand in this, but by saying that I think this was terrible of the Meraglim to not go into the land of Israel. And the other thing I'll say about the character, I always find it fascinating that the Tanakh itself, in different parts, whether it's Tehillim or other places, we think of the Midbar in two opposite ways.
Yes, totally.
The Midbar is either the side of tribulations in which we tested God and we were unfaithful and God kept God's faith in us and God's covenant with us, or the Midbar is Chesed Neoraich. The Midbar is the wilderness, is the place in which we proved ourselves and in which we were faithful to God despite it all. And I think it's fascinating that the same place is the side of, it's a metaphor for both faithfulness and disloyalty at the same time.
Totally. And I'll just say from the academic prism, that's looked at as a Yirmiyahu concept, meaning the idyllic version of the Midbar is far less, and it shows up in fewer places. I think that's a really important piece. And it goes to the same meaning, even within Tanakh, we have the ability to look at two metaphors through which we look at the same event. I think that it's saying something similar to what we're seeing in the more modern commentaries. I'm curious, though, Mijal, you mentioned before sort of how to look at Kalev and Yoshua, meaning I really like the way you phrased it, and correct me if I'm saying it differently, but we focus a lot on the fall of the scouts, but we don't often give enough attention to what it means to be two people who stand up to that. And just one more piece that I want to add to that before I really would love to hear what you have to say about this is that the title of the series is From Chaos to Order. Sorry, From Order to Chaos. And this Parsha itself is built very similarly, meaning it opens exactly the way Bamidbar opens. It has a list. It has these leaders. It has the plan. The plan sounds good. And then, the reality is obviously much messier. So just this Parsha, and of course, that's most things in life. Most things, we usually come in with some sort of plan, or I'll even take my metaphor of the car ride. Everybody's in, everyone's in their seat. We have the snacks, we have the games, right? And then at some point, everything starts to unravel. And the piece that I also found beautiful as a reminder from a different Rashi, which connects to this point, is that he says, why is the juxtaposition of this to the story of Miriam? Because it's always about bad speech. And it's this interesting question to think about what makes things begin to unravel, right? Like sometimes, again, if we take the silly dynamic, it's someone who gets angry in the car or a kid who took someone's snack. In this case, it's a negative kind of a speech. And it takes these two men to come. How do they restore order, right? They're going to use that same kli, that same tool, to do something very different. So I'm like sort of throwing at you a few different ways to look at it. And really, I mostly want to hear what you have, what you've like come with us today. But, and I think about the tool of speech and how it can unravel and how it can hold things together. And I'll be really honest with you. I really, unfortunately, think about this daily in regards to just like my own handling of my children and the after, later in the day. I very often can pinpoint the moment that I unraveled. I might not have been the first one to unravel, but it snowballs after I unravel. So anyways, I'm just throwing that out there and sort of think a little bit about Kalev and Yoshua and what do they do here?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the word unraveling, and there's almost like, there's like this, I wish there was a nicer word to say contagious, right? Like we shape each other, we take cues from each other, leaders, communities, like it's all interconnected. So I'll say with Kalev and Yoshua, I actually became fascinated with them a couple of years ago. Here in the States, the culture wars and the politics are a little bit different than in Israel. And again, 3 years ago or so, or before that, depending who you ask, whatever, but you could begin to see in many spaces that used to pride themselves in disagreement and in argument and in open-mindedness, just an intensely thick pressure towards conformity, towards groupthink. And there's like all of these areas of speech and ideas that in certain spaces you couldn't raise because you would immediately be judged or even the word was like canceled or taken out. And living through that was actually really, there was something there that it's like you read about this in books, but you don't understand what it means to feel so pressured, right? That if everybody's saying something and you're the next one in line and you're like, do I say, do I not, do I stand alone in the crowd? And it's very easy to kind of, for me, it was easy to always assume that you'll be the one who's always going to say the truth no matter what. But then when you're actually going through it, you realize the intense strength of social pressure. So in those years, I started to think about Kalev and Yoshua and thinking, oh my gosh, they're extraordinary. Like as a kid, I was like, okay, they did what they were supposed to, and the other guys were the bad guys. Now, as an adult, I'm like, the 10 spies are really human, and a lot of leaders and people behave like that when in crisis, and we fail. And Kalev and Yoshua are extraordinary because they are able to actually resist the pressure of publicly going against these 10 men, being a tiny minority, like compared to them. And they're also able to resist the pressure. Like, it's not just the 10 men. It's like you feel the energy in the crowd. When the Meraglim present, there's almost like it's violent. The crowd is ready. They're hungry for blood. And Kalev and Yoshua resist that. They literally resist that. So I just started to think, and I read up on a bunch of experiments. There's a famous series of experiments, if anyone's more interested in this, conducted by Solomon Asch, who basically would bring people into a room. They wouldn't know that they were the only person who wasn't part of the experiment. So Ash and his team would basically show, I'm going to make it up, but they would basically show 10 people 2 papers with 2 lines, one clearly shorter than the other. And they did a series of experiments, and they basically primed so that, let's say that 8 people would all say the wrong answer because they were all told to, and then it was the turn of the real subject. And what they found is that, depending on which type of experiment, you have like different numbers. But I'll just read over here. There were 18 trials in total. And Ash was trying to see what would happen. I'm just reading this quickly. On average, about 32% of participants went along and conformed with the clearly incorrect majority. And we're not talking here about an incorrect evaluation of something that is ambiguous. We're talking here about like mamash, like You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And over 12 trials, 75% of participants conformed at least once.
Wow.
Only 25% never conformed. I like to read Caleb and Yoshua next to Ash, like in light of each other. Number one, to remind me, all of us think that we would have been Caleb and Yoshua. But according to a lot of experiments and knowledge that we have about the social condition, that's not true. So to me, the real question, the pedagogical, spiritual, moral, educational, communal question that we need to ask is, what does it take to help us be like Caleb and Yoshua? How do we help shape, right, communities of people and leaders who can actually resist when they know something is wrong, even though the cost is heavy? And there's a lot of things here. I find really, really powerful here, and what I've taught my students when I teach about this is I say, I don't think, I mean, it's all thinking out loud. I don't think the story would have happened if Caleb or Yoshua were alone. What I mean to say is that I think they needed each other. They needed a pair. You need a chavruta.
Wow.
To help you stand up against the crowd. It's very, very hard to almost impossible to be like Tzaddik Baston. Like, it's so hard. And there's something here that it's telling us. It's almost like you have a sub-community within a sub-community. You have a pair of people, I'll use my own language, who can give each other moral strength. I can imagine them like late at night touring the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and you have all the men talking, and then afterwards you have Caleb and Yoshua going and being like, well, what do you think? And they're like, no, stay strong. We know we are right. And it's that chavruta, that fellowship, right, that companionship that I think is at the heart of what helps us not just think of them as exceptions, but think of them as models to exception, right? That we need to be able to insist in having those people in our lives. Barry Weiss has a quote that I love saying. She says, courage is contagious. And I think it's so true. In the same way that fear is contagious and helplessness and lashon hara and etzara and all of that, courage is contagious. And here it just takes the two of them to be able to raise an opposing voice. And it is the two of them that end up leading the people to the land of Israel.
First of all, it's a beautiful idea. And I want to sit with it more and think about it more. And when I was thinking about this question, as you're sort of describing it, I'm thinking, well, you have to be a person who somehow grew up with like a tremendous sense of self-confidence, or right, meaning there is a certain like internal grit that you have to be that kind of person, but you also have to be really socially on target in order for you to be people to listen to you. Meaning it's like I was thinking of like the internal components of like a self-confidence, a clarity of vision, and also like a social adeptness for people to be able to listen to you. But I totally missed that piece about the partnership. I've never thought about that, and that's such a powerful idea. Like we can't go up alone, get to all these things. I just wanted to say that this idea about having a partnership just really echoes what we saw with Moshe, right? Moshe also adjudicating needs partners, and Moshe, even as a spiritual leader, needed the Shivim Zekenim, like this idea that to do really serious leadership, hard stuff, there needs to be more, this energy needs to be spread out with at least somebody else, if not others, I think also comes through in other stories as well throughout this period. So that's such a powerful idea.
Yeah. And that, by the way, goes back to part of what I think here in the States. It's funny, I almost feel, I used the word inadequate before. It's part of what I feel when I talk about our problems to people in Israel. You mentioned before yourself, your spouse being in the army. I don't have that. But we do have problems. And one of them is this feeling of a lot of people feel very lonely. You walk outside, you look at like the guy next to me in the subway today was wearing a decolonized Palestine pin. And I was just wondering, what does he mean by this? And should I take my own tag to show to him? And, but there's a certain, I think Israel feels lonely as a country. And I think in America, a lot of American Jews feel lonely as individuals.
Yeah.
Especially those whose entire social circles and professional circles are with people who hold views that often dehumanize people that we love and care for. And part of our job here in the States, right? We have a lot of jobs. It's a war with multiple fronts. One of our fronts, or one of our jobs, one of our battles, to me, is to build Jewish community, because we need to strengthen each other. You cannot go and face the world alone if you don't feel like you have this thick sense of knowing who stands next to you, and knowing that you have somebody to fall back into, and that you have somebody that you can talk about other stuff and not always be fighting the world. right? When you're talking to them. And that's part of what I think is the work that we have to do, in our part of the work.
I just want to just dovetail that for one moment as we end our conversation and say that, Mijal, the whole reason why I made this the theme of this book is because I felt like living in Israel, I have the ability to get smaller and smaller and be like kind of sucked up by like the survival reality that's still going on. And I agree with everything you said. I, as someone who has a foot in two spaces, am very aware of the multiple fronts of this war. Even though many Israelis without that relationship with the world outside of Israel don't understand to the same degree, how much there is struggle and different kinds of wars that are going on. At this point, I think most know, but for a while, people weren't able to see both at the same time. But the reason why I wanted to have these conversations specifically with people like you is because I want these conversations to happen. I feel like they're fruitful on an individual level, and they're fruitful on a broader Jewish communal level to understand that like everybody is going through all different things, and it's okay. We can't all be invested in the same in all of the same endeavors, and we each have our own places where we're contributing. But I'm so happy you brought all of that. Like, meaning this is exactly why I wanted to have you. So I just wanted to really thank you for bringing all of those pieces. And I don't think there's anything inadequate about it, but I understand like the feelings on all sides. So I just really wanted to thank you for bringing like also these really, really powerful ideas about the spies, and also how they're genuinely meeting the reality that you and all of and so many people are in right now. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you for having me. It's beautiful to learn your Torah from here, from the States, and to get Torah Eretz Israel, and to be part of this conversation across the distance.
Amen.
And to learn together.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.